Hello and welcome to China Forum, your leading program for discussing current events and issues in Chinese politics, culture, economics, and social issues. Today we're filming on location at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and we will be joined by Dr. Ashley Tellis, who is a senior associate here specializing in international security, defense, and Asian affairs. He has served as a senior advisor at the State Department as well as working for the National Security Council staff. And Dr. Tellis is uniquely qualified to help us discuss Sino-Indian relations today, as he has authored two books, one, India's Emerging Nuclear Posture, and the other, Interpreting China's Grand Strategy, Past, Present, and Future. So he obviously has a great deal of expertise on both China and India, and we're very pleased to have him join us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
To start out, we're going to talk about a topic that has really brought Sino-Indian relations to the forefront, and that is Premier Li Keqiang's recent visit to India. He actually made India his first foreign destination after being named premier. So do you think this signals a new push by China to bring a renewed emphasis to Sino-Indian relations, or how should we interpret this trip?
I think that's a reasonable way of interpreting it. The fact that the premier decided that India was going to be his first port of call from the wide choices that China has around the Asian region, I think was meant deliberately to signal that China wants to consolidate the gains that have been made in the bilateral relationship in the last 2 decades. And this visit, of course, was preceded by an exchange of letters between Xi Jinping and Manmohan Singh, during which both sides indicated the priority that they intended to place in consolidating the bilateral relationship. So I think your basic reading is right on the mark. China was attempting to signal that India was not going to be a forgotten dimension of China's Asian engagement, and that they wanted to put things on an even track for this next several years to come.
So in a broad sense, when the Chinese government looks at India, what are they hoping to get out of this relationship? What are their main goals for broadening this engagement?
I think there are at least 2 sets of goals. One that are linked directly to the bilateral relationship, and a broader set of goals wherein the bilateral relationship is embedded in China's larger calculations vis-a-vis Asia and the world. And let me start with the narrow objectives first. I think China has recognized that the bilateral relationship has improved considerably from the years when China and India were constantly at loggerheads with one another. Since the late 1980s, when Rajiv Gandhi was India's Prime Minister, Sino-Indian ties have improved quite dramatically. And today, even though China and India have a variety of disputes, there is a border dispute, there are frictions over trade, and so on and so forth, the fact is that the border itself has been extremely tranquil for most part over the last several decades. And China would prefer to keep whatever disagreements it has with India under control, on a tight leash, not disrupting the gains that have been made in the larger relationship. So that's a very narrow set of aims. There is a broader set of aims. I think the Chinese government has recognized that China's rise as a great power has caused a certain degree of consternation within Asia writ large. And there are suspicions about China's intentions. There are concerns about China's behaviors, both within Asia and in the United States. And I think the broader calculation that China has is it wants to prevent India from, in a sense, bandwagoning with the other Asian states that have been anxious about China. And the best way to do that is to make certain that Sino-Indian relations essentially remain on an even keel, because that provides the Indians with the greatest incentives to continue their engagement of China rather than switching to some alternative form of behavior. And so between the narrow objectives and the broader objectives, there turns out to be a remarkable degree of coherence from the Chinese point of view.
Well, let's also look at the Indian perspective. What are they hoping to get out of this increased engagement with the Chinese? And do they share some of these concerns that you were mentioning of anxiousness about China's rise? And how does that factor into their relationship?
There's a fascinating parallel between the way India looks at China and China looks at India on at least one important issue. And that is both sides want to make certain that nothing disruptive happens in the bilateral relationship that will undermine their respective emphasis on sustaining economic growth. For both countries, sustaining economic growth is the single most important geopolitical priority, and for identical reasons. For China, it is a means of distributing the gains that have been made in the last 30 years to even broader segments of their population and becoming the great power that China once was, in a previous millennium. For India, it's the same calculation. India has a large population, a large segment of which is extremely poor, and continuing their economic growth at the levels that they've experienced, say, 5 years ago, provides the only way of distributing the gains of development. And so both sides want to prioritize economic growth. They want to avoid disturbances in their bilateral relationship from becoming so acute that the goals of advancing growth are disruptive. And so for India, clearly their first objective is to keep the relationship steady so that India can continue to concentrate on economic growth. So that's number one. Number two would be to deepen the trading relationship with China, because one of the things that India has appreciated since the reform process began in '91 is that China has much to contribute to India's economic growth. Clearly today China is a big consumer of Indian natural resources, but when one moves beyond the natural resource trade, there are very specific achievements that China has demonstrated that India would want to partake of. For example, Chinese capacity in construction, civil engineering on a large scale, Chinese achievements in manufacturing. These are things that India would want to partake of. So I think expanding trade would be the second area that India would focus on. The third is simply making certain that the geopolitics is managed. And there are clearly concerns that India has about China, as many other Asian states have. But the key to managing those geopolitical concerns is embedding them in a larger framework of cooperation. And I think that's what this Indian government and any Indian government that succeeds at will continue to persist.
You mentioned how both countries are very interested in continuing their economic relationship, and that seemed to be the primary focus of Premier Li Keqiang's trip to India. Most of the agreements signed were economic agreements. Most of his remarks had to do with economic relations. So do you think that there is a lot of room for cooperation economically between these two countries, or are there also concerns that they might be at loggerheads in some areas and be more competitive economically than cooperative?
I don't see, while there are always frictions, including in the area of economics, I don't see the competitive dimensions overshadowing the cooperative dimensions. Clearly, there is much greater room for growth in Sino-Indian trade. Right now, unfortunately, that trade is relatively imbalanced because China not only has a trade surplus, but it is also a trading relationship that is highly asymmetrical. That is, China is a very large exporter of manufactured goods to India and a very large importer of Indian raw materials. I don't think that is a sustainable basis for trade over the long term, because particularly from an Indian point of view, it reminds them of something that happened 200 years ago under colonialism, where the colonial powers essentially exported manufactured goods to India and imported Indian raw materials. So there is a legacy there that leaves India uncomfortable. And that is the area of friction that one, begins to see articulated in the Indian press every now and then. The trade imbalances too are areas of concern, but my own view is that Sino-Indian trade has really not reached the potential that it could. It can reach much higher volumes and it can be much more diversified. And I think both New Delhi and Beijing recognize that. And my expectation is that through the agreements that Li Keqiang has signed, the next 10 years will see both an expansion and a diversification of that trade.
So one concern that has been raised, and you touched on it, is the trade imbalance. India has a large trade deficit with China. Do you think that has the potential to decrease as trade becomes more diversified?
I think it would. I think it would. As Indian manufacturers begin to make inroads in China, and it's very clear that China has, broadly speaking, the comparative advantage of manufacturing. But there are some segments of manufacturing that means that both sides have claims, but there is no physical marking of the border on the ground. And so the normal practice has been that both sides engage in patrolling up to the limits of their claim lines, but don't essentially stay there or build any permanent facilities in the areas that are thought to be disputed. The deviation that occurred this time around, and it's peculiar because it's not quite clear what led up to it, was that a Chinese platoon essentially went to the limits of its claim line and stayed put instead of returning to its rearward bases as it usually does. And that, of course, caused a concern in Delhi. And there was, as you mentioned, a minor mobilization, which was diffused quite quickly within a matter of days. So hopefully something like that won't recur. But the bottom line is this, that as long as the border is not resolved, it will always hang as a shadow on the other improvements in the bilateral relationship. Because there is a fear in India that as Chinese power grows, China might one day come back to reclaim the areas it considers its own from a greater position of strength. And India at that point would be unable to resist either the diplomatic pressure or the military force that could be brought to bear. So this is a corrosive sort of uncertainty that hangs over the fortunes of both countries. Now, having said that, both sides, I think, recognize that it's probably unlikely that they will be able to resolve this border anytime soon. And so as long as they stick to the agreements that they have made, which is that neither side will take any steps to disturb the physical tranquility of these borders on the ground, I think we will end up just leaving this problem to be resolved by a future generation. And that may probably be the best thing, one can expect, given the complexities of the issues involved.
Sure. When you're talking about territorial disputes, India is not the only person that China is having these disputes with, but most of its disputes have been in the maritime regions. We've seen a lot of activity there. Is this at all affecting India's calculations about its territorial dispute with China when it sees China clashing with Vietnam or the Philippines in the maritime area?
I think it does, even though Indian policymakers will be very shy about admitting to that fact. What certainly has happened in the last 3 or 4 years is that Indian anxieties about the way China manages its territorial claims have increased. And those anxieties have increased because I think the Indians see two elements coming together all at once. One, there is a dramatic distension in Chinese military capabilities, which have been steadily growing, but have now reached the point where they're maturing and can actually, change the status quo. And the second is that the United States has turned, or at least gives the appearance of being in retreat. And both these elements leave India somewhat uncomfortable because as long as the United States played the traditional role that it did of balancing Chinese power and providing some sort of stability in the entire Indo-Pacific region, the Indians had lesser reason to be worried about their own borders. But the fact that Chinese capabilities have now reached this maturity at exactly the time when the United States appears to be, less forceful in its presence in the region has unsettled Indian strategists and I believe also Indian policymakers. So there has certainly been an uptick in Indian concerns in the last few years that were not manifested, say, even 6 or 7 years ago.
And another area of concern for these Indian strategists is the so-called string of pearls in the Indian Ocean. China has been developing commercial relations with ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, many countries neighboring India. And this has caused a little bit of concern among some strategists that China is trying to encircle or contain India. So how is this affecting the relationship as a whole?
Well, I think the string of pearls has now become this sort of epithet that has been used by many Indians who are deeply suspicious of China to accuse it of encirclement. And I think that is a misreading of obviously what is happening in the region. As you point out, many of these relationships that China has with the peripheral countries in the Indian Ocean region are relations that are driven by commercial calculations. And the investments that have been made in port facilities and so on are largely economic investments that do not necessarily have a strategic calculus. Having said that, however, it is entirely possible that over a period of time, what starts out as economic investments could provide certain strategic benefits. And Indians are particularly concerned about this because it takes them back to a previous era where in the era of colonialism, the flag followed trade. And so whenever they see China intruding in what they see as their own geopolitical sphere of influence, they become cautious about the possibility that what starts off as a commercial relationship could eventually end up providing strategic benefits that could undermine Indian security. So there is certainly a degree of caution. But I think, this is also going to be representative of the new world that we are going to see increasingly in the future, which is everyone is going to be everywhere. The very nature of global interdependence means that you are going to have cross-cutting patterns of engagement. And I think India will have to learn to live with this reality, just as China will increasingly have to learn to live with the reality of India also operating in its own backyard, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and in the Western Pacific.
One of these commercial ports is actually in Pakistan, where a Chinese company has been called in to help revitalize a port there, which is an area of fairly deep concern for India based on its rocky relationship with Pakistan, which brings up a larger issue, which is that China has historically had a very close relationship with Pakistan, while India has had a very rocky relationship with its neighbor. So going into the future, how do you see Sino-Pakistan relations influencing Sino-Indian relations?
I think from an Indian point of view, what China does with Pakistan will always be an issue that captures Indian attention. Because as you point out, India-Pakistan rivalries are not likely to disappear anytime soon. And so to the degree that China finds itself injected into this rivalry, there will be implications for Indian security. And Indian policymakers will always look askance at things that China may do to increase Pakistani capabilities against India. Now, from a Chinese point of view, I think that relationship with Pakistan now is so deep that it is unlikely to be jettisoned anytime soon. But I think Beijing has become a lot more sophisticated in how it handles the India-Pakistan relationship. It has attempted to avoid providing any sort of support for what may be considered Pakistani adventurism, while it has cautiously provided Pakistan with assurances that the very quality of the relationship with Beijing should provide sufficient insurance against India doing the worst possible things that one could imagine to Pakistan. And I think trying to walk that balance between supporting Pakistan without encouraging it to do destabilizing things. I think that's the policy that Beijing is going to persist with for a long time to come, because it's the only sensible policy, actually, for China at this point.
And we've talked a lot about potential disagreements between China and India, but they also have a lot of factors in common. While Premier Li was in India, he kept emphasizing that China and India are both Asian powers. They're both rapidly developing countries, and they both have very large populations. And he was proposing that they could, based on these factors, cooperate in the international sphere, at the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, to help give a voice to other developing nations. Do you see a great potential for this sort of cooperation, or will these other issues we've been talking about limit what China and India are able to do together?
I see some potential, but not as much as is often advertised. And it's not because the bilateral disagreements or the bilateral irritants would come in the way. Rather, it is because even on international issues, although China and India share some congruences, those congruences are often more superficial than people think. China and India may have commonalities in the sense that they are rising Asian powers and that they are upstarts in an established international system. But there is still a big gap in Chinese and Indian capabilities. And because there is that gap in capabilities and achievements, their national interests actually diverge, even on the issues where sometimes people think there is strong convergence. So, for example, when one looks at the nature of the international cyberspace regime, or when one looks at the nature of the regime in outer space, or even the distribution of status claims in the international system, like, for example, how the UN Security Council ought to be reconfigured. There are quite considerable differences between China and India on all these questions. The convergences are closest in the area of economics. So, for example, if you went to Beijing and New Delhi and asked them whether both countries should be given more seats or greater voting rights in institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the answer would be yes. But when one asks a further question about how ought these increased voting rights to be distributed between the two, I think you would get quite significant differences in the preferences on both sides. So my short answer to that would be there is certainly room for much greater cooperation between the two countries on issues of global order. But we ought not to exaggerate the degree of coordination that one is likely to see between these two countries, because when one looks at the details, their differences do diverge on some very important considerations.
And India and China are also often grouped together with two even more different countries, Brazil and Russia, to form the so-called BRIC nations. And they have been trying recently to coordinate their efforts to rearrange the global order to give these developing nations more of a voice. How does this sort of multilateral diplomacy factor into the India-China bilateral relationship?
I think it's important because it provides another plank for cooperation. But my own view is that neither India nor China really are going to overinvest in groupings like the BRICS. The BRICS provide a forum whereby countries that oftentimes want to create a new international order can meet and exchange ideas. But the BRICS grouping is handicapped by one very simple reality, that each of the countries in the BRICS grouping have much greater stakes and place much greater value on key relationships with the established international order. Like, for example, their individual relationships with the United States, or their individual relationships with the EU or with Japan. And it is the priority that both India and China and each of the BRICS countries would place on these individual relationships that I think at the end of the day outshadow whatever cooperative activities they may do in the BRICS. So for whatever it's worth, it's another avenue for cooperation. But I don't think it is either going to displace their interest in engagement with the other major powers of the international system, or become some sort of an alternative to the established means of conducting diplomacy in international politics.
So if China and India were to make a concerted effort at maybe the most common factor that they have together, what do you think would be their top priority?
I think their top priority would be growth and development.
Okay.
That is the one thing that unifies both countries. And both countries will drive their foreign policies in ways that will attempt to protect the priority they place on growth and development.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have today, unfortunately. It was a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for answering my questions today,
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Tellis.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us at home, viewers. We will see you next week on China Forum.